Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Chris Deeran. I'm the director of Enlighten, as you probably know by now, Scotland's independent, non-partisan think tank, and delighted to welcome you to today's event, which I think many of us have been really looking forward to. I'm just going to do a quick introduction and hand over to Keir Bloomer, who many of you will know is the chair of our Commission on School Reform. And Keir will be having a conversation with Sir Nick Gibb, who was England's schools minister from, well, the best part of over a decade, really, from 2010 to 2012, 2014 to 2021, and 2022 to 2023. Obviously, that was a Conservative government over that period. But I would say that Nick is greatly respected across the political boundaries for his achievements as schools minister. He's described by the Daily Telegraph as the most influential schools minister in England's history, which I think is probably just a statement of fact. Nick's credited with overseeing a sharp rise in pupil performance over that period. We can see from the international comparative studies that the English education system is the best performing of the UK nations. And certainly from a Scottish perspective, there's a lot to be learned there. And we may ask why we haven't learned more of that sooner than we have as we've gone down the international charts, watching England soar past us. So Nick's recently published a book entitled Reforming Lessons: Why English Schools Have Improved Since 2010 and How This Was Achieved. Co-authored that, and that book explores the key principles behind England's reforms and reveals the impact they had on school leadership, accountability, teaching methods, curriculum design, and pupil behaviour. So it's a real joy to have you with us, Nick. Can't wait for this conversation. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Keir.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Chris. And good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Nick.
Afternoon, Keir.
Your reforms involved significant changes to curriculum, to pedagogy, and school ethos. Were these all equally important, or would you consider that any one of them was preeminent?
That's a tricky question. I think they are all equally important. What unites those three things is philosophy or ideology, because I was trying to work out when we were in opposition between 2005 and 2010 what was going wrong with our schools, because although we're rising in those international league tables now, between those two dates, we were hurtling downwards, very significantly downwards. And I wanted to find out why. And what I discovered from visiting schools every Monday for 5 years and talking to teachers and heads and reading around the subject, talking to experts, was there was a kind of ideology of education that was the cause of our decline. And that ideology involved all those three things: ethos, pedagogy, and curriculum.
Right, thank you. The other change which took place during the period when you were the schools minister was changes to school governance and the academies programme. If Scotland is to emulate England in making the kind of progress that was made during your period in office, do you think it's necessary for us to change the way in which schools are managed?
I do, actually. Interestingly, well, maybe not interestingly, but when we were developing policy, I was less fussed about the governance issues. I thought that was something that Michael Gove felt very strongly about, and so I just, I went along with it. And we built on the Labour Party's previous policy of taking really badly performing schools away from the local authority, giving them a sponsor, and working on them to improve them. And that worked. It was a policy that was very successful. That was Andrew Adonis's policy. And I was in favour of it. I had one of those 200 schools in my own constituency in Littlehampton. So I was pleased by the action that was being taken to deal with that school. The more I thought about it, and certainly when we came into office, I realised you need to deal with the governance as well as the things that I was most passionate about, the things you talked about in the last question: curriculum, teaching methods, and the ethos of the school. But if you don't have the governance issue sorted out, what happens is that the local authority will basically prevent schools from being able to adopt evidence-led approaches to pedagogy and curriculum. There was a salutary lesson for me was when I was an MP and I visited a primary school in my constituency, and I said, "Do you teach children the multiplication tables?" And they said, "No, I'll go and ask the county council whether I should." And that horrified me because this is a teacher 20 years experience. She should be able to make her own decisions. But the lesson I really learned from that is that if we, as a government, had sought to encourage or require, indeed, schools to teach tables or a knowledge-rich curriculum, then maybe a lot of that might have been thwarted by the soft power of local authorities over the schools. So it was important, actually, to both do the things I wanted to do on curriculum, but also to get those schools out of the hands of the local authorities that could do so much damage to prevent my reforms being successful. The a long answer, yes, I think that Scotland should follow that approach. It's similar to the charter school system in America, except that in England, it's not just 6 or 7% of schools that are charter schools. 83% of secondary schools, high schools, are now academies, and nearly half of primary schools are.
Right, thank you. You mentioned Andrew Adonis there, and one of the things that I noticed in your book was that you refer in quite approving words to at least two of your Labour predecessors, particularly Andrew Adonis. So this is as near to a party political question as I'm going to come, given that Chris said we are a non-partisan organisation. Do you think that your reform programme was in any way distinctively a Conservative programme, or granted the fact that there was some continuity from the work that Andrew Adonis had done, do you think this was a reform programme that any political party interested in improving education could have tackled?
100% yes to the latter part of your question. This is not a right wing or a left wing issue. Some of the most articulate supporters of these reforms are from the left, and not just, happen to be politically of the left. They are active members of the Labour Party who support them. And why would they not be? Because who are the children that most benefit from a more structured approach to the curriculum, a more knowledge-rich approach to the curriculum, better discipline and behavior in schools, more direct teaching? The children who most benefit from those type of reforms are children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And if you are on the left, those tend to be your priority in terms of what drives you in political thought. So absolutely. And I mean, Bill, given that we did build on the reforms of the Blair administration, and actually, and one of the people I talk about in the book, the directly elected Labour mayor of Newham, he and I worked very closely. I was looking for a local authority that would become a champion of phonics and the teaching of reading, would get every school. I couldn't find a Conservative one that was interested, but I did find Sir Robin Wales, and he and I worked together. And I don't know if you know how well you know the boroughs of London, but Newham is very, very poor. It's probably one of the poorest boroughs in the country, but they came top in the phonics tests several years running in the mid 2000s. So absolutely, this should be a left-right. It should not be a left-right issue. It should be cross-party. And it disappoints me that the current Labour government in England isn't more enthusiastic, although they have kept in place a lot of the reforms, like the phonics screening check is being kept in place.
I'm glad that you mentioned phonics, because of course that's one little link between us. And while much of this Zoom is going to be taken up, I think, by talking about things that Scotland could import from England, this is one thing that you actually imported from Scotland. How important in the overall scheme of your reforms do you think the introduction of phonics was?
Oh, absolutely central and vital. Reading isn't just important for reading. There's a lot of evidence that being able to read fluently and effortlessly early on in your school career helps you with mathematics, and obviously it helps you with other subjects, history, geography, the sciences, of course. So absolutely vital. And the way we were teaching reading prior to 2010, and it's similar in America and New Zealand and Australia and Scotland, was using the whole language approach to the teaching of reading, where children are encouraged to try and identify the word as a whole through frequent sightings of the word. And also what we had in England called the searchlights model, like a multi-cueing approach, where children use various cues or clues, like the context of the story, the grammar context, even the picture, to try and identify a new word. Well, that isn't reading. Reading is the phonics approach, where you're taught the sounds of the alphabet. There are 44 sounds in our 26-letter alphabet, and then how to blend those letters into words. And I came across this debate that was happening globally. It's called the Reading Wars. It started in the 1950s in America with a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. And the book blames the fact that this 10-year-old couldn't read on the new methods of whole language approaches. So I was aware of this debate. I met some phonics experts in England in about 2004. And they introduced me to the Clackmannanshire study, and that's where our link comes. And I was so delighted to meet you on Saturday in Glasgow, because that Clackmannanshire study, as you know, as you were the director, I can't remember whether you were the director of education or the chief executive of Clackmannanshire at the time. You had held both posts. But that study was so important in shifting the political debate in England. So this is a study of 300 pupils and divided into three groups. 100 children were taught systematic synthetic phonics, and then the other two groups were taught variations of the kind of mixed approaches that we had in England. After 16 weeks of that study, the phonics group was something like 9 months ahead of their chronological age. No, sorry, 9 months ahead of the other two groups, and 7 to 8 months ahead of their chronological age in word reading. And then it was so successful that you put all 300 pupils onto the synthetic phonics group. You were morally obliged to do that. It was sinful not to put them all on the group, given how successful it was. So the researchers from St Andrews University in Hull, Joyce Watson and Rona Johnston, they followed those children for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, at the end of primary, those children had a word reading age of 3.5 years ahead of their chronological age. It was so significant that it influenced the debate in Parliament in England, and we ended up then with the Rhodes Review, and then to the policies that we introduced.
I think that this discussion of phonics has got some bearing on the question of the place of decentralization and central control in the education system. The then Scottish government had funded all Scottish authorities to develop both numeracy and literacy programs, and two of the literacy programs, the phonics programs, our own and the one in Western Barton, were particularly successful. But nothing was then done to try and universalize these systems in Scotland. Whereas you made the use of phonics a legal requirement in the curriculum in England. At the same time, of course, you were decentralizing many aspects of governance to schools. Where do you think the correct balance between centralization and autonomy lies?
So it's a very good question. It's a hard question as well. I remember one of the union leaders, Mary Bastard, said to me, you talk about autonomy of your academies, and yet here you are telling us how to teach reading. Isn't there a kind of contradiction there? And I said, look, there is an inherent contradiction there, but just let me have this one. Because reading is so important. I think the autonomy is important, but the autonomy is to school level, these academies that we have, so that the professionals that lead those schools can do the things that their professionalism tells them work, what the evidence says worked. However, there also had to be some central direction in this debate, because for decades, really since the 1950s, so you're talking about more than half a century, ideas that were not evidence-based had taken hold. They'd come from America, actually. They come from Teachers College, Columbia, in New York in the 1920s, John Dewey, William Herd Kilpatrick, based on the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Romanticist philosopher. And those ideas had come from America, and they had become firmly embedded, this sort of progressivist ideology, in the education world in England, and probably the rest of the UK as well. And so to undo all that to blow up the concrete, if you like, of that firmly embedded ideology, you had to have leadership from the top, from Michael Gove and from myself, changing the law, allowing, persuading indeed, schools to think beyond that ideology and to actually look at the evidence of what works. And we actually set up the Education Endowment Foundation, which was committed with an objective of looking at the evidence from using the sort of the gold standard of what scientific evidence you should look at and which you should not look at.
I suspect that a lot of people tuned into this particular Zoom are thinking to themselves, it would be very nice if at some stage we get an education minister who can talk about education like this man can. And one of the things that strikes me, this is a slightly more personal question, was looking at your career and at your background. You were the schools minister for the overwhelming part of both the coalition and the Conservative government's period in office. Before that, you had been for 5 years, I think, the shadow minister. But even before that, you had done a great deal of reading about education, visiting schools, and thinking about what you saw. Now, that combination of interest and expertise in a topic and long-term in office in relation to that topic is an unusual one. Do you think it is important to a reform programme of the type that England carried through to have somebody with that kind of background alongside a succession of different secretaries of state, of course, who were bringing perhaps slightly different priorities, but were also giving some political heft to the changes that were going on?
That's a good way of describing it. I do think the secretaries of state that I worked with in that period did bring some heft, and they brought some skills I didn't have, which was the political. They had more political skills, I think, than I had, in the sense I wasn't that interested in politics, and you do need that. I mean, I'm more interested in politics now than I was at that period, but you do need that, as you say, political heft as well. It's important. But I also think that generally in politics, you need to take the issue seriously. And it's interesting in economics, people do take the issue seriously. Everyone debates taxation levels and monetarism and regulation and how you get economic growth. That is an issue that politicians feel they should be well versed in and knowledgeable about. But somehow, when you get to other policy areas, whether it's housing or the health service or education, they seem to take those issues less seriously and think that they don't need to become as experts in that as they might be in the economic field. And I think that is why in Western democracies we don't deliver on some of the priorities of the electorate. And I've also often said that civil servants are great. I think we have in Britain, UK, England, Scotland, all four nations have really good civil servants. They're uncorruptible, highly proficient, but they're not good at policy because they don't have constituents. They don't, I'd be surprised if there are if any civil servants on this listening to this podcast, they don't, generally speaking, engage in political debate and conversation, because that's not what they do. They do delivery. And so if you rely on civil servants for your policy development, I think you'll just essentially get the sector's views conveyed. And that is not a recipe for reform. The sector doesn't want to be reformed. So if you have ministers that are not deeply knowledgeable and haven't spent time understanding the sector they're trying to reform, then inevitably they will rely on the civil servants. And then inevitably, in my judgment, you'll get weak policy. So I think, what is the purpose of politicians? The purpose of politicians is to develop policy. It's hard work and it's sometimes boring. Politics and gossip is more exciting. So, but you won't get delivery of the change that the public want unless you do have politicians that are deeply embedded and interested in the minutiae of policy.
You mentioned earlier on that at the time that you came into office, performance in England had been in decline for some time. And I suppose one of the principal measures of that is PISA, which gives you a standard of comparison with how things are going in other countries. So it's perhaps just worth reminding ourselves that during, roughly speaking, the period when you were the minister, Scotland's score in all three PISA domains has fallen actually quite substantially. In England, you went up from 27th to 11th in maths, 16th to 13th in science, and 25th to 13th in reading, which is a very substantial measure of progress across a decade or so. Were you now to be invited to become the Education Secretary in Scotland, which I admit is probably unlikely, where would you start?
I think I would start with reading, but I've been talking to some education ministers around the world, and some of them just crack on and do maths as well. So and the knowledge-rich curriculum. So I think there is a case for doing all three at once. And so you do. So you reform. I mean, reading is obviously the most important, and you've got to get that. I think the phonics screening check is important to get that in place rapidly. Change the law to require the teaching of reading using systematic phonics. But also, I think you can start work on the maths as well, because I think Scotland is where Scotland in maths. It's 30th in the world in maths
Yes.
compared to we've gone up to 13th. Sorry, no, we've gone up to 11th in maths. So I think, and we looked around the world to see who was top of PISA, and Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai. These are the places that East Asian countries dominate the top of PISA in terms of mathematics. So we've got stuff to learn from them, I think. And although there are cultural differences, of course, between nations, you can still learn from the methods they use to teach mathematics. And so I think you could do that as well at the same time. And then I think slightly over a slightly longer term, but not too much longer, look at the content of the curriculum. You have the curriculum for excellence, which I think is problematic. I think it does need to be more specific about the actual content, the actual knowledge that children need to be taught in each of the years that they're at school. I think you need to look at that as well.
I would obviously agree with that very strongly. Do you think, I'm sure you do, that there is a connection between the knowledge-rich curriculum and the way in which people learn?
Yes, I do. So what the sort of prevailing view around the world, promulgated by the OECD and others, and indeed it's very dominant thinking in Scotland, is that what you should be teaching are those high order intellectual skills, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, and they term these three skills 21st century skills, but they're actually universal skills that go back before the 21st century. They're really important. We do want school leavers to have those skills, but and here's the big but: you can't teach them directly. You can't have, well, today's lesson is problem solving. Let's learn some techniques about how to solve problems. Those highly important skills come from the knowledge. And this is what I learned from Edie Hirsch in a book called The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them, how important knowledge is. And it's important for social justice reasons as well, because he says knowledge builds on knowledge. And a child coming to school from a disadvantaged home where there's not much education at home, but if knowledge builds on knowledge, they will struggle to acquire new knowledge. But the more advantaged children, they come to school, and even if the school prioritizes skills, they will be able to gain knowledge because they have an existing level of knowledge to build on. And then the other important book is Daniel Willingham's book called Why Don't Students Like School? And he makes the point, as do other cognitive scientists and psychologists, such as John Sweller in Australia, that the working memory is very small. The working memory, though, is where these high order intellectual activities happen, but it can only handle 5 or 6 new pieces of information at once. So if I gave you 2 phone numbers, you could possibly recite them back. If I gave you 35 phone numbers and said, please recite them straight back, there's no way you could. And that's because the working memory is small. But, the working memory needs to think about more than 5 or 6 pieces of information. And you can't keep looking up things. You can't say, well, kids can just look it up. You don't need to cram them full of knowledge. But, you can look up the boiling point of water, the freezing point, the capital of France, what are 7 sixes. By the time you've looked up 8 things, you've forgotten the first 3. And you don't just need 8 things, you need tens of thousands of knowledge to be able to critically think. So Willingham says the purpose of an education is to get knowledge into long-term memory. And by knowledge, we don't just mean, boring facts. We mean knowledge, concepts, understanding, procedures in the long-term memory. So the short-term memory, the working memory can draw on them with ease when they engage in those activities. So, and that is not what is in the essence of the curriculum for excellence, or indeed we had a competence-based curriculum as well in England, which we got rid of. It came in 2007, as did New Zealand, and they're abolishing theirs too, because of this understanding that we have now about how the brain works and how children learn.
Yes, I think that the last point you make there is a strong connection between the things that you have just been talking about and our increasing understanding about the learning process and indeed about the neuroscience linked to it.
Indeed. And so people often say, well, you just want to go back to a golden age of children is sewed ranks, learning lots of things. But actually, this is based on modern science, and it's a modern approach. It just happens that the importance of knowledge, it has now been shown to be absolutely vital in terms of developing those higher order skills.
Returning for a moment to the three cornerstones of the reforms that you made to what is actually happening in the classroom as opposed to the organisation of the system. I'm talking here again about the knowledge-based curriculum, teacher-centred instruction, and what I think you called warm, strict classroom ethos. Did you see this as a one-size-fits-all solution, or are there circumstances or indeed are there groups of children for whom this is not the best approach?
Well, there are some subjects. I mean, I think that children should be facing the front so they can see the teacher and they're not craning their necks. But there are some subjects, art, for example, where it may be good to put them at a table facing each other and so on. I mean, there are some children that need a one-to-one approach to their education. They have special educational needs and so on. But I think actually the more challenging children are, actually, the more important these issues are, that they're not distracted by other things happening in the classroom, noise, other children. So actually, some of the things we learned about what works for most children, they're even more important for some children with special educational needs as well. So, and what's interesting about the Academies program, and I would call it the kind of renaissance of the teaching profession in England, is that the thinking now that's happening amongst teachers is way beyond the kind of things that Michael Gove and I were thinking about in leading up to 2010 and beyond. That they've taken hold of their own profession and they're now talking about things like, as you say, warm strict. That didn't really come from Michael or me. That's absolutely come from within the academies movement and the teachers. And that's about making sure children are obeying all the rules, the minutiae of the rules, but they're not, those strict rules and the enforcement of those rules are not done with the kind of crossness to it. They're done with love and warmth, and because we want the best for the children. But things like retrieval practice, obviously cognitive load theory is taking hold, and now schools are producing really high quality curriculum materials that they're distributing to other schools around the country. So there's wonderful things happening, and they're saying that same thinking is happening, of course, in areas of special need as well.
I'll ask you one more question and then give everybody in the audience an opportunity. My last question really follows on from that. Obviously, the Academies programme has produced some exceptional schools. The one that you referred to when I listened to you on Saturday was Michaela, but there are others as well. At the same time, there are still in England some pretty bad schools. And I suppose the contrast in Scotland is that there is a greater uniformity of provision, which you might call universal mediocrity. But where does the balance lie here? Is it all right to have a system which creates excellence, but has a great disparity in provision between one school and another? Or is it necessary to strive for some degree of commonality?
It's a very important question. I mean, the thing about Michaela, and as you said, there are others like Mercia School in Sheffield as well, and others beyond that. What they have shown with their absolutely amazing education they provide for their children is that deprivation is not a barrier to high achievement in academic study. It really isn't. The grades that Michaela, that serves a very disadvantaged part of North London, Brent, the grades they get in their GCSEs, your listeners may not be familiar with the system, but the GCSE in each subject, the gradings are 1 to 9. 9 is like an A star star, so it's like the top 4.5%, 5% of children get the nines nationally. At that school, 50% of the grades are nines. It's astonishing. There's only one other school that gets that, and that's Eton College, the most famous, highly selective academically school in the world. So, they're providing. So what Michaela and Mercia and others show is you can that this notion of these kids can't achieve this or that is absolute bunkum. That any child can achieve highly academically, and that their background is irrelevant if they're taught properly. So that's the great thing about what we call the free schools movement. This is new schools established by people like Catherine, by teachers and other schools, and there are 650 of those. But you make a really good point. The job is not finished. There are still too many schools that are underperforming. And if I could be in office again for a longer period, my focus would be on there's about 12% of schools, secondary school, the schools that are not rated by Ofsted as good or outstanding. That's a much lower figure than it was when we came into office in 2010, but it's still 12% of schools. And I think if I were there now, I'd be taking a much more, if you like, dirigist approach to saying, look, we now know what works. Warm, strict, direct teacher-led instruction, knowledge-rich curriculum, phonics, East Asian structured maths. We now insist that you adopt those approaches in your school. And if you don't, we'll find a different set of leaders that will. And that does sound as if, my goodness, that sounds very harsh. But, I think we've got to be a bit tougher now on the remaining 12% of schools that are languishing because, the children that go to those schools will not have as successful a life as the children that go to Michaela. And because we know now what works, it's unacceptable, really, that knowledge isn't being applied in all schools.
Thank you.
Keir, do you have access to the chat box where people have lodged some questions?
I? Yes.
That might be the best way to draw some questions out. I think Sarah was first.
But let's ask Sarah then.
I think you might have answered mine. Hang on a minute, I've forgotten it. Sorry. It's if we have elections obviously next May, and I don't know if there are any candidates on this chat. If we had to choose, would you put political, say we have a new government or whatever government we have in May, would your political energy go into governance, or should the political energy go into what's taught in the classrooms and how it's taught? Because I mean, your book was amazing. I mean, it was a kind of like a complete unpicking of every little bit of a system, and then kind of turbocharging a kind of creative energy in teachers and schools, which is a kind of the real social entrepreneurship that we know of. It's in all our great school leaders. But it's a big, project over quite a number of years, and lucky to have you in post throughout. But what's most important? I think you've already answered really.
I mean, I say you need to do all of them, but I don't understand enough about Scottish politics to know how much political capital there is available for challenging the education establishment in Scotland. So if you have to prioritize things, I would say the reading is so important beyond anything else that's where I would if there's a limited amount of political capital to go around for the education reforms, I would put it all into that, frankly, and I would introduce a phonics screening check for 6-year-olds, and I would require teachers to teach reading using this method, and I changed the law to make that happen. So if that uses up all the capital you've got available, then just do that, and you'll see significant improvement. Interestingly, Keir was talking about PISA. The reading results in PISA for Scotland are not that bad. Scotland is 13th as well for 15-year-olds. They haven't taken part in Pearls or Tim's, and I understand that Scotland is going to rejoin Pearls. So we'll find out a bit more about the reading of younger children. But and I think the reason why, I don't know, it's pure conjecture, but possibly why the reading isn't as bad as the maths and science is because of Clackmannanshire and West Dunbartonshire, that there is a sort of people are thinking about phonics in the sector because of those studies, and there could be other reasons as well. Keir's probably better. You're probably better equipped, so to have views on those than I am.
I've got a question here from Janine. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi Nick. Hi
Hi,
Keir.
Janine.
I'm blown away by the changes that you made in England, and I only wish had been made in Scotland because it certainly would have saved my child and his ability to read. Unfortunately, for quick background, I've had to take him out of school and flexi school and close his reading gap myself, following the science of reading that the local authority and the school's leadership team don't know anything about. So I'm really interested in getting the changes that you made in England implemented in Scotland as a parent. But those changes required strong leadership, willingness to push change through. And the feeling in Scotland is that we just don't have that same kind of strong, accountable leadership. So if it's not going to come from politicians and the establishment, what would your advice be to someone like me to bring change around?
Well, I think campaigning, is important. There's so much evidence now. I mean, there's that wonderful. I mean, this wasn't available when I was campaigning, but the Emily Hanford podcast that came out, I think, in 2022, called "Sold a Story." I mean, it's very compelling, and I think it has stories in it similar to yours, Janine. So I think I managed to get some changes put through before we came into office, but I was an MP and I was on the Education Select Committee, so that obviously helped to do that. But I do think campaigning is important and just getting the message across to teachers, because teachers are in charge of their own classrooms ultimately, and if they're made aware of this evidence about what works, what I found in England is that when teachers were introduced to the systematic synthetic phonics approach to teaching reading, they saw the progress the children were making, that they could read simple words within weeks of starting school, and the confidence that that instills in children. I mean, it's wonderful for teachers to see that, and they do, and they become supporters of the approach once they see it in practice. So I think there's a lot that can be done at the sort of campaigning school level. I think it's quite important to do that.
Question here from Stephen Hamilton. Stephen? Okay.
Yeah, you've kind of just started to answer that, Nick. I wanted to ask, were teachers as well as local authorities resistant to your reforms? And if so, how did you overcome that? And can I stress that I was a teacher, so I'm not asking that question from an anti-teacher perspective out of interest.
I mean, these are not easy things. I mean, I'm a chartered accountant by profession, so I'm not a teacher. And then my next profession was Member of Parliament, 27 years. So that's not a teacher either. And here I am as a minister saying, oh, I think you teachers, with all your experience and training, you're doing it all wrong. You should use this method. It's it's quite a challenging thing to do. I got lots of criticism for it. It's like sort of me going into an operating theatre and saying, "Oh no, I don't even want to do that with the scalpel." You know, it is tricky, and you have to be quite measured in a way. And you have to know you have to be sure that the evidence that you are relying on is absolutely accurate. So Keir, I hope the stuff you did in Plat Manager was right, which I'm actually sure it was because it's been corroborated by other studies as well around the world. But so it's not easy. It really isn't easy. It's just about making the case and being prepared to take some criticism.
Thank you.
Lindsay Patterson.
Thank you. And thanks, Nick, for such a brilliant book. It's probably the best book as an academic that I've read by a policy maker on policy making, on any subject of policy. It really should be standard textbook in political science classes, but let's leave that aside. I have a question about teachers as well, which Stephen has sort of asked, but I've got a supplementary to it. But before I say that, let me just mention briefly the comments you made about Scottish performance in PISA reading scores, which do appear to be somewhat better. There's two things I would say about that. One is that there's a complicated thing about how far back in PISA we can go in each of the three domains. PISA, the OECD, which runs PISA, explains that for valid long-term comparison, with science you can only go back as far as 2006, with mathematics only as far as 2003, but with reading as far as 2000. It's got to do with standardization of statistical measures. And if we go back to 2000, which the Scottish government never does, we find that Scotland was far ahead of the OECD average. And if we compare Scotland in 2000 with Scotland in either 2018 or indeed 2022, we find a catastrophic fall that is as big as the later fall in science and mathematics. So the only way in which Scottish reading scores can appear to be quite or not as bad as in reading as in mathematics and science is if we start from the baseline of 2006, but the harm had already been done in the early years of the century. So that I think is something that is never properly addressed in Scotland because the standards. Indeed, I may say that when the OECD published its most recent report on Scottish education, I gather that the Scottish government, the OECD wanted to include a graph that went back to 2000 in reading, and the Scottish government insisted that that graph be taken out and started only in 2012. The spurious reason was that is when the present Scottish government came to power, but actually the real reason was to avoid the embarrassment of going back to the beginning of the century. However, that's a kind of statistically
really
kind of comment.
Really
let me take up go further with Stephen's question about teachers, and absolutely that I had been going to ask that very question. So let me give a supplementary question. In order to be able to take teachers with you and to change the ethos and the expertise and the professionalism of teachers, as you explain in your book, you introduced all sorts of wonderful new networks. You mentioned already the Educational Endowment Foundation, but the Research Ed, the teacher networks of sharing research expertise, that's a great idea. But the problem, of course, is that requires a diversity, a pluralism of ideas available to teachers to be discussed. Many of these ideas have come from those parts of the English university system, teacher training establishment, that are not part of what you described earlier on accurately as the progressivist ideology. There has always been dissenters, for example, in the University of Durham, in some of the more, in fact, outside education departments in the cognitive science and psychological communities. The problem in Scotland is the overwhelming uniformity of the ideology of the Scottish teacher education establishments. There are 8 of them. And for example, when John Swinney, when he was education minister here at the beginning under Sturgeon's leadership, he tried to introduce a version of Teach First, the innovative teacher training program that was started by Labour and that you and your colleagues continued, Nick. He tried to introduce a version of that into Scotland, and indeed Aberdeen University was on the verge of going live with that. And it was shut down by the 8 deans of these 8 faculties, refusing to have anything to do with this initiative coming from a democratically elected politician. Now, in that kind of atmosphere, maybe I'm being too pessimistic here, but it seems to be it's going to be much more difficult to bring in the pluralism of ideas. Yes, of course, many teachers in Scotland are already sharing in the work that is being done by colleagues in England and indeed other countries. But there is still this monolithic, this intellectually monolithic establishment in Scotland that it's extremely difficult to challenge. So dissuade me from my pessimism if you can.
Well, that is interesting, and we didn't face that hurdle. So Teach First, those young people, they want their PGCE, and universities will grant it. In fact, and they do a lot of their initial sort of summer camp training in the universities. But I do think we share a commonality with Scotland that our educational faculties are, generally speaking, the centre of progressivist education, and it is not pluralistic, really, if you take the sector as a whole. Obviously, there are exceptions, the CEM Centre at Durham, Rob Coe and so on, when he used to be there, was really important for us in helping to evidence what we were doing, and the kind of Tallis and Yallis tests that he used to conduct over many years were very helpful in demonstrating the grade inflation we had in our system. I found dealing with the educational faculties very challenging, and we left reform of the university education departments right up until 2018 before we started that process. But I think, I don't know, I can't remember how many teachers there are in Scotland. We have 450,000 teachers in England, and amongst those, there will be a variety of opinion. And I think it's a matter of allowing them, giving them the permission, if you like, away from that sort of oppressive, non-pluralistic, prevailing orthodoxies that did exist in England, and just giving them permission from the centre. So I think if you have a minister or a group of ministers in Holyrood who understand this debate, and therefore intervene and overrule the deans, then I think you can make progress. I really do. But the darkest hour is just before dawn. I'm hoping that there will be some political. So I don't think you can do this without leadership from the political world.
There's a question here from Catherine that's not unrelated to this. Do you want to ask your question, Catherine? Okay, I can read it out. Can you talk about your relationship with the teachers' trade unions as you were implementing your reforms?
Yes, and that's, I mean, at that stage we had 6 unions, 2 teacher unions, two head teacher unions, 4 teacher unions. They've dwindled down to 2 of them have merged. I always made sure I had good personal relations with them, so I would meet regularly on a one-to-one with general secretaries, as well as the meetings, the more formal meetings we had with the unions. Mainly because I wanted them to understand the sincerity of what we were doing. This wasn't just politics as usual. Here was a properly thought through a set of approaches. And what Mary Bousted, for example, she ran NASUS she ran the Association of Teachers and Lecturers at the time, and then the NEU. What she used to say was she didn't agree with a single word I said, but respected the sincerity. And I think that helps. I think that my approach, Michael's approach, wasn't cynical, but we did face opposition from them the whole time. And I think you've just got to, the approach I always took to our reforms was, what is the worst they can do if they oppose something? And so the phonics screening check, for example, this is a test for 6-year-olds, very, very controversial when it was devised and introduced, opposed by the unions, opposed still by the unions. My fear was that the worst they could do was boycott it. And I did not want that to happen. So I compromised and said, look, we'll have the test, but we won't publish the results on a school-by-school basis in the way we do for the end of primary school tests in reading, writing, and maths, and the way we do for GCSE results in secondaries. But it would be available to the inspectorate. They fought that bit as well. They said, no, you shouldn't let it be available to the inspectorate. I stood firm on that. And that's how we ended up what we ended up. So sometimes you have to compromise in understanding the genuine concerns of the trade unions, but I would never compromise just for an easy life, just to avoid criticism. Not interested in doing that. Why would you compromise on something you know is right? Just so you don't get criticized on Twitter. But if I felt that it was going to lead to something real that was damaging, then I would compromise with the views of the union. So it's about having a proper grown-up conversation, dialogue with the unions the whole time. I suppose we were helped by the fact that in 2010, we were in the middle of austerity. We were just recovering from the banking crash. I think we're still recovering from the banking crash. And there was big reforms to the public sector pensions. And I was sort of leading the negotiations with the Treasury on the teacher side. So the unions were taking up a lot of their bandwidth in dealing with that rather than our reforms.
Tim Jones, you have your hand up.
Hello.
Hi, Tim.
Hello, Nick. Yes. I'm a candidate for next year's election. standing for Edinburgh Eastern, Loughborough and Trent, and I've just written a chapter on an agenda for school reform, which was part of Malcolm Offord's Wealthy Nation, Healthy Nation. And I've made 23 recommendations for change. And obviously, I'm going to put it as central to my pledges in my campaign. However, Nick, one of the problems, and it's already been stated today, is that we know the PISA results are very bad, and many described as catastrophic. However, I have to say, not a single constituent of mine has ever come up to me and said, Tim, we really need to get education sorted out. Nobody has ever said that to me. So there's a real cultural problem in Scotland in terms of aspiration. Well, I think the aspiration is there, but there seems to be a blindness as to actually what is happening. I wonder if you could give me some guidance on this.
Yes, I mean, some things don't get cut through to the public. I mean, the same in England in 2010, nobody was sort of talking about PISA. They think that was a tower in Italy rather than a survey of education. But there was a concern amongst employers about the standards of reading and maths of school leavers, and there was a concern by universities that had been expressed that undergraduates were not as well prepared as they had been in previous generations. So that had some salience, and I think there was quite a bit of concern amongst parents about the quality of their local school. It's interesting that Keir, I think it was Keir, talking about the sort of the more constrained variety of standards in Scotland schools. We had a bigger gap between good and bad schools in England, and if you happen to live in an area with those bad schools, then this was an issue that would have been raised by constituents with their candidates and with their local MP. But there are some things, I mean, we didn't go into I can't remember what was in the manifesto, whether we mentioned the Academies programme, but things like that never get cut through to the doorstep. They just don't. I think reading does, behaviour does, even maths can. But I think what's important for parties and the political process in democracies is to provide some leadership as well as just only having policies that respond to things people express concern about. I think you're standing to be a member of the Scottish Parliament. That is a leadership position in Scotland, and therefore you have a kind of duty also to understand the problems facing Scotland and how what your analysis is of solving those problems, even if it's not something that's the headline of the the Scotsman.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Gillian Evans.
Hi. I wanted to just add a little bit about phonics. Rona Johnson's work was published by the University of St Andrews in 2000, and anyone could have accessed it. But I think Jack McConnell at the time said, oh, we share it by best practice. Nobody implemented it. And we had Sue Ellis running around the country from Strathclyde's being anti-phonics, pro-comprehension. The West Dumbarton Shuddies was a PhD by Tommy Mackay. His success criteria was children leaving school at 16 had a reading age of greater than 9.5, which was atrocious. The other study done at the same time was North Lanarkshire, and they ended up with a product called active literacy. And the Scottish government promoted it in the year 2011. It was a searchlight model that was basically eradicated in England. So that phonics was teaching the 44 sounds over 2 years. So teachers, if you ask them, do you do phonics? They go, yes. But if you say, do you do 44 sounds in 16 weeks? They'll go, No. But my question is Scotland used the University of Durham, 2/3 of councils measured the reading ages of their children using the science of reading, the decoding ages, word reading ages, comprehension, spelling. Brilliant data, never given to the parent. Every local authority that used that data knew the number of children who left primary school functionally illiterate in primary 7. The Scottish Government brought in their own standardised assessment, no reading ages calculated. How important was it for England to share the data with the parents? Because the teachers' unions here say we do not want league tables. They're hiding the data from the parents. And so the previous question was, the reason why parents are not jumping up and down, they're totally in ignorance of how bad things are going on in their schools.
I think one of the advantages we had in 2010 is that we inherited from a previous Conservative government, the 1988 Act followed by the 1992 Act that brought in testing, and then it made them require them to be published on a school-by-school basis, and that was kept in place by the Blair administration and the Gordon Brown administration. We had that advantage. We had an accountability system. We had Ofsted, and we had the publication of results at school level already in place, and so that meant that we had a mechanism for, if you like, enforcing the changes that we were making through that accountability process. And when I did go around the world talking about these things, and there are lots of countries that don't have that. And I think it is very important to have an accountability measure, a process, particularly if you go down the autonomy route. If you take schools away from local authorities and then you give them autonomy, you can't just give them autonomy because they could just stay in bed all day. You've got to have something that holds them to account, and that's why you need that account. So I think data is very important. We give, although we don't publish the phonics screening results on a school level basis, we do collect those results. They are given to the inspectorate. I used to pore over them actually on a school by school basis. I used to write to all the schools getting 100%, and then I used to look at the ones at the bottom to see what action we were taking to deal with those schools. So, but also the schools are required to give the results of the phonics screening check to the parents so they know whether children are. What's interesting about your question and about you, Gillian, and we met on Saturday as well, is that you've got Lindsay here and you've got Keir, and I think these networks of people are terribly important in driving this agenda. I met the Reading Reform Foundation in 2004 in England, and those meetings for me were terribly important as a policymaker. And I think the same would happen anywhere. That don't underestimate the power of those networks, particularly if you have the level of knowledge that you do, Gillian, in terms of the research that you've done, in helping persuade and helping politicians who want to do the right thing, helping them to do it. So I would just say that to you as well, but I'm sure you're doing that anyway. But these networks are very important.
I think we've just got time for one more question. So I'll invite Chris M to ask the last question because it's focused on an area which has been central to the Scottish Government's thinking for a while. Chris M.
Thanks. Yeah, the Scottish Government seems to be very focused on the poverty-related attainment gap. So that is the gap between children from the most and least deprived areas in the country. Do you think this is good to have this as the key area of focus, or is this misguided? Should we focus on another measure?
I think it is a very important measure. I wouldn't necessarily put it down to areas. I'd say you want to close the gap between children from disadvantaged backgrounds and their more advantaged peers, wherever they are. And that was the mantra that Michael Gove and I used to justify everything we did. And what's interesting is all the things I've been talking about, all the reforms we've introduced, they are designed and they deliver better outcomes for the most disadvantaged children. So if you look at our score in Pearls, this is the reading ability of 9-year-olds done across the world. We're fourth in the world in that most recent Pearls survey. But the reason we jumped from joint eighth to fourth was our average score was pushed up by the least able children. Now, that doesn't necessarily correlate with disadvantage, but the least able children performed significantly better because of our reforms to phonics. So I do think it's an important. I mean, why are we even debating education? What is driving us? Is it because we want the geniuses to be even more clever? Well, actually, we do want that because we want the cures for all kinds of problems that the world faces. But the actual driver of our discussions and debate is helping the most disadvantaged plus the least able to do better and to fulfill their potential. That's what's driving this conversation today. So I think trying to close that attainment gap, I think, is absolutely the right objective.
Right, thank you very much. I think everybody who's present will agree that this is possibly the best educational Zoom that Enlighten has been able to host so far. And the reason for that is the quality of the contribution from Nick Gibb. So we are extremely grateful to you, Nick. And in an effort to shoulder Lindsay aside from being your main salesman, can I just say that I would recommend any member of the audience to have a look at Reforming Lessons. It is a splendidly written book. It's not all by Nick Gibb. It's the head teacher, Robert Peel, involved in it as well. But if you want to understand how to carry through a programme of far-reaching and successful reform, do read it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Keir.